Good day, everyone. Let's discuss freedom. This opening slide introduces the central theme of today's lecture, the relationship between freedom, human action, and moral responsibility. It situates the lesson within moral theology, signaling that our inquiry is not only philosophical, but also theological, rooted in the human response to God's grace. The title frames the entire discussion as an exploration of how human beings act freely and how those actions become morally meaningful. The slide also sets the intellectual and pastoral tone. By linking freedom to responsibility, it suggests that moral life is not accidental or mechanical, but deeply connected to human dignity and accountability. This establishes that our goal is not merely theoretical analysis, but how human freedom shapes moral decision making and character formation. For example, when we consider everyday decisions, choosing honesty over deception, helping someone in need, or acting out of danger, we immediately see that freedom makes these actions morally significant. If we had no freedom, which by the way shouldn't be understood univocally, such that in philosophy we have many notions of freedom, and in this case we need to think with the church in terms of what it understands freedom to be. Going back, if we had no freedom, praise or blame would lose meaning. This invites us to think about our own experiences of choice and responsibility, and to recognize that moral theology begins with real human actions. With this foundation in place, the lecture moves from the general theme to a more focused question: why freedom is central and important to moral theology, and what makes it essential for understanding moral responsibility. Why freedom matters for moral theology. We need to explain why freedom lies at the heart of moral theology. If moral theology studies how humans respond to God's grace, then freedom becomes indispensable. Without freedom, human actions would not be truly personal. They would simply be reactions or biological processes. We need to emphasize that moral responsibility presupposes the capacity to choose. It also warns against misunderstandings of freedom. If freedom is ignored, morality becomes coercive. If freedom is misunderstood, morality collapses into relativism, where any choice is considered equally valid. We therefore need to frame freedom as the condition that makes moral evaluation possible and meaningful. Consider a student pressured into cheating. If the act is done under extreme coercion, he was forced, moral responsibility may be reduced. But if the student knowingly and willingly chooses to cheat, responsibility becomes clear. Freedom is what allows us to distinguish between forced behavior and genuine moral choice. Having established why freedom matters, we now turn to a key thinker who offers a structured understanding of freedom within moral life. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas on freedom. We present Aquinas' understanding of freedom as neither random spontaneity nor unlimited choice. Instead, he locates freedom within the interaction of reason and desire, where the intellect recognizes what is good and the will chooses it. The intellect recognizes what is good. So it's the intellect that recognizes it and the will chooses it. Freedom in this view is not about doing anything we want, but about intelligently pursuing what is truly good. Aquinas' approach integrates three elements: reason choice, ordered desire, and moral formation. Freedom emerges from the cooperation between intellect and will. This means that freedom grows when a person becomes more capable of recognizing and choosing authentic goods. For instance, someone choosing a career path may feel free not because they have endless options, but because they clearly understand their values and goals. A person who knows the good, such as justice, honesty, or compassion, can act more deliberately and meaningfully than someone acting impulsively. With Aquinas' framework in mind, we now shift to a foundational question: what makes an action truly moral rather than merely something a human happens to do? And when that is the question, we now move to the issue of the human act. The human act, actus homini. Here is a crucial distinction. Not every action performed by a human being is a moral act. Aquinas differentiates between involuntary biological processes and deliberate actions rooted in knowledge and will. Only the latter are subject to moral evaluation. This distinction prevents two extremes. On the one hand, it avoids moralizing everything, such as breathing or reflexes. There's no morality there. On the other hand, it protects human agency by affirming that deliberate actions truly belong to the person and thus can be judged morally. For example, sneezing or blinking has no moral value because it happens involuntarily, but choosing to tell the truth, help a stranger, or harm another person involves awareness and intention. These are genuine human acts, and therefore they carry moral weight. To deepen this idea, we need to clarify between simple human behavior and morally meaningful human acts. Human act, actus homini, versus actus humanum. Or what we say, human act versus act of a human, or act of human. We clarify Aquinas' distinction between the acts of a human being and human acts. Acts of a human being include biological or involuntarily processes such as breathing, digestion, or reflexes, actions that occur without deliberation. Human acts, in contrast, arise from knowledge and voluntary will and are therefore morally accessible. This distinction becomes foundational for moral theology because it defines where responsibility begins. Only actions freely chosen with awareness can be judged as good or evil. Moral life, therefore, is centered on decisions shaped by intellect and will rather than mere physical processes. Consider driving a car. Accidentally jerking the wheel due to a reflex differs morally from deliberately steering recklessly. The first is an involuntary reaction. The second is a human act involving intention and decision. Moral responsibility applies to the latter because it flows from conscious choice. Now that we understand what qualifies as a truly human and moral act, we now proceed to identify the conditions that make such acts morally accountable. And what are those two essential conditions? Knowledge and voluntariness. Knowledge and voluntariness. We identify the basic requirements for moral accountability, knowledge, and voluntariness. For an action to be morally assessed, the person must know what they are doing and must freely choose to do it. These two conditions protect moral theology from unfair judgment, ensuring that people are not held fully responsible for actions done in ignorance or under compulsion. We also show here that moral responsibility is not automatic. Ignorance can reduce or even eliminate responsibility, depending on whether the ignorance itself is blameworthy. Similarly, coercion, fear, or compulsion can compromise voluntariness. Moral evaluation, therefore, requires attention not only to what was done, but to how freely and knowingly it was done. Imagine someone signing a document without understanding its contents. If they genuinely did not know what were agreeing to, The responsibility differs from someone who knowingly signs a fraudulent agreement. Likewise, a person forced to act under threat may bear less responsibility than someone acting freely. With these conditions established, we now move from prerequisites for moral responsibility to the internal structure of moral action itself. The structure of the moral act. We introduce the idea that moral actions have a structure that can be analyzed. Aquinas proposes a framework later called the three fonts of morality to explain how actions become morally good or bad. This approach allows moral theology to avoid simplistic judgments while maintaining clarity. The structure recognizes that moral life is complex. Actions are not judged only by outcomes or intentions, but by multiple dimensions working together. By studying this structure, we gain a method for careful moral discernment rather than relying on emotional or purely situational reasoning. For example, helping someone financially might seem morally good, but if the money is stolen, the action becomes morally problematic. The structure of the act, what is done, and under what conditions must all be examined before reaching a moral judgment. We now present the three specific dimensions that make up this structure and guide moral evaluation. The three fonts of morality. We outline the three essential elements that determine the moral character of an act: the moral object, the intention, and the circumstances. The moral object refers to what is chosen. The intention explains why it is chosen. And the circumstances describe the context in which it occurs. Aquinas insists that all three must be morally good for an action to be fully praiseworthy. This approach prevents reducing morality to a single factor. Neither good intentions nor favorable circumstances alone can make an act morally good if the object itself is wrong. Consider giving money to charity. The object is helping the poor. The intention might be compassion, and the circumstances may involve urgency or need. If all three are good, the act is morally good. But if the intention is self-glorification, or the money is obtained unjustly, the moral evaluation changes. These The lecture now deepens this framework by emphasizing a crucial principle. All three dimensions must align in goodness for an action to be morally right. And yes, all three must be good. This slide emphasizes Aquinas' principle that an act is morally good only when the object, intention, and circumstances are good. A good intention cannot justify an evil project or object, and favorable circumstances cannot transform a wrong act into a good one. This protects moral reasoning from consequentialism, the idea that outcomes alone determine morality. The slide highlights a balanced moral vision. It acknowledges the importance of intention and context, but insists that the nature of the act itself matters. This ensures that moral evaluation remains grounded in truth rather than shifting with convenience or results. For example, lying to achieve a good result, such as protecting someone, still involves the moral problem of falsehood. Even if the intention is good and circumstances are urgent, the object remains morally disordered. Moral theology then seeks alternative actions that preserve both truth and protection. Having clarified this idea, the lecture now explains why this framework is so important for moral theology. Why does this framework matter? We need to explain the practical value of the three-font framework. It provides clarity without oversimplifying moral life. By considering object, intention, and circumstances all together, moral theology avoids both harsh rigidity and careless permissiveness. The framework also protects against moral errors. It resists consequentialism, which focuses only on results or outcomes, and it supports responsible discernment. Moral reasoning becomes a thoughtful process that considers the complexity of human action while remaining grounded in truth. In pastoral or professional contexts like medicine, law, leadership, decisions often involve competing goods. This framework helps individuals weigh not only goals, but also methods and context. For instance, a doctor must consider not just the intention to heal, but also the ethical legitimacy of the treatment and patient's circumstances. With this structure established, the lecture now moves from theory to application, examining how the three funds operate in concrete moral situations and how freedom and the will shape moral actions. Practical application of the three funds. We apply the framework of objects intention and circumstances to a concrete case, lying to protect someone from harm, or what we now call as white lies. It demonstrates how moral theology moves from abstract principles to real life ethical discernment. Even when intentions are good and circumstances urgent, the moral object must still be examined carefully. The example highlights the tension often present in moral decisions. Protecting an innocent person is a good intention, and danger may create pressing circumstances, but speaking falsehood remains morally problematic. Aquinas' framework, therefore, encourages deeper reflection and creative moral reasoning rather than quick justification. In real situations, such as protecting someone from violence, people may feel compelled to lie. Moral theology asks whether alternatives exist: silence, indirect speech, or other ways of protecting the person while preserving truthfulness. The goal is not rigid legalism, but responsible discernment grounded in moral truth. From this applied example, we now move to a broader consideration of the faculty behind human action, the will, and its role in freedom. Freedom and the will. This is a new section focusing on the will as the source of human action. Having examined what makes actions morally evaluable, the lecture now explores how those actions originate. The will is the faculty that chooses, and therefore it is central to understanding freedom and responsibility. Aquinas sees the will not as arbitrary or impulsive, but as oriented toward the good. The will initiates actions based on what reason presents as desirable. This understanding connects moral responsibility directly to the interplay between intellect and desire. For example, a person deciding whether to help someone in need does not act randomly. They perceive the situation, recognize it as meaningful, and then choose to act or not. The will bridges knowledge and action, making moral life possible. To deepen this idea, the next slide defines the will more precisely and explains how freedom emerges from its relationship with reason. Let's look at freedom as a rational appetite. The this one the slide defines the will as a rational appetite. It seeks what reason presents as good. Freedom, therefore, is not blind impulse, but the result of cooperation between intellect and will. The intellect identifies possible goods, and the will chooses among them. This understanding reframes freedom. It is not simply the ability to pick randomly among options. It is the capacity to pursue authentic goods intelligently. True freedom arises when reason and will work together toward what is genuinely good. Consider choosing a path of service, such as caring for family or committing to a vocation. The intellect recognizes the value and meaning of these goods, and the will embraces them. The resulting action is not less free because it is guided by reason. It is, in fact, more deeply free. With this definition established, the lecture now explores two major implications of seeing freedom as rooted in reason and truth. Let's look at the two major implications of this one. We identify two key implications of Aquinas' view. First, freedom presupposes truth. To choose well, we must know reality accurately. When reason is distorted or misinformed, freedom becomes compromised because the will may pursue false goods. Second, error and ignorance affect responsibility. So if a person sincerely believes something is good when it is not, their responsibility may be reduced. This highlights the importance of education, moral formation, and truthful understanding in shaping freedom. For instance, someone raised in an environment where dishonesty is normalized may struggle to recognize truthfulness as a moral good. Their freedom is not eliminated, but it is affected. Moral growth requires learning to perceive and value genuine goods more clearly. Recognizing these influences on freedom leads us to the next topic: the specific factors that can diminish or modify voluntariness in human action. So, what are the factors that basically can affect voluntariness? That's the next question here. Factors affecting voluntariness. The slide outlines several factors that can weaken voluntariness and therefore affect moral responsibility. Ignorance, coercion, timor, fear, habit, and strong emotions. Aquinas presents a nuanced view that acknowledges how complex human decision making can be. These factors do not necessarily remove responsibility, but they shape its degree. Moral theology does avoid simplistic arguments. Instead, it considers the psychological, social, and emotional realities that influence human action. A person acting under intense fear may make choices they would not otherwise make. Someone struggling with addiction may find it difficult to act freely even while remaining morally responsible. And recognizing these realities fosters both justice and compassion in moral evaluation. With these factors identified, we now move toward a deeper insight. Moral responsibility exists on a spectrum shaped by the degree of freedom that is present in every action, which is our way of saying responsibility admits degrees. We need to emphasize that moral responsibility is not simply all or nothing. It exists along a spectrum, and Aquinas recognizes that human freedom can be strengthened or weakened by many factors, and therefore moral culpability varies depending on the degree of voluntariness involved in an action. This perspective involves both realism and compassion into moral theology. It avoids harsh judgments that ignore human limitations while also avoiding the opposite error of excusing everything. Moral responsibility increases when actions are fully voluntary and decreases when freedom is constrained. For instance, a person acting with full awareness and deliberate intent bears greater responsibility than someone acting under confusion, fear, or psychological pressure. In pastoral contexts such as addiction, recovery, or trauma counseling, this principle helps distinguish accountability from condemnation. Having explored how responsibility varies, the lecturer now turns to a new development in moral theology, a renewed understanding of freedom as something oriented toward excellence rather than mere choice. Freedom for excellence. This slide introduces Survey Pincus and his recovery of the classical understanding of freedom. Instead of seeing freedom as simply the ability to choose among alternatives, Pincus presents it as the power to act well and pursue genuine human fulfillment. This perspective shifts the focus of moral life. Freedom is not defined by number of options available, but by the ability to choose the good consistently and meaningfully. Moral growth, therefore, involves formation, virtue, and alignment with truth. A musician who practices daily becomes more free to perform beautifully. Similarly, a morally formed person becomes more capable of acting with justice, honesty, and compassion. Excellence expands freedom rather than limiting it. To understand this vision more clearly, the next slide contrasts two different ways of understanding freedom. Two conceptions, two conceptions of freedom. We contrast freedom of indifference with freedom for excellence. The first refers to the modern idea that freedom means the ability to choose anything without reference to truth or moral value. The second reflects the classical view. Freedom is the capacity to choose what is genuinely good. The contrast highlights how different moral frameworks shape behavior. If freedom is seen as pure choice, morality becomes subjective. If freedom is oriented toward excellence, moral life becomes a journey of growth towards fulfillment and virtue. A person who can choose between honesty and dishonesty may appear free in the modern sense, but the person who has formed the habit of truthfulness and naturally chooses honesty demonstrates a deeper, more mature freedom. One that is rooted in character and moral clarity. The lecture now explores the defining characteristics of this richer understanding of freedom. Characteristics of freedom for excellence. We need to describe how freedom for excellence operates. It is perfected through virtue, expanded by repeated good actions, guided by moral norms, and oriented toward the good. Freedom increases as a person becomes morally formed, not as opinions multiply. This view reframes moral norms. Instead of being restrictions, they become guides that help individuals develop and flourish. Freedom, therefore, is thus seen as dynamic and developmental rather than static. A person who practices patience becomes freer in relationships because they are less controlled by anger. Similarly, someone who cultivates generosity becomes freer to serve others. Virtue enlarges the capacity for meaningful action. The next slide summarizes this vision with a powerful statement about the true nature of freedom. What's the true nature of freedom here? True freedom is not the power to choose evil, but the power to act well. Freedom is fulfilled in the pursuit of authentic human flourishing. The person whose will is aligned with the good, such as a saint, represents the highest expression of freedom. This idea challenges common assumptions. Many people think freedom means having no risk constraints, and Pinkers argues the opposite. Freedom is greatest when a person is capable of consistently choosing the good with clarity and joy. Consider someone who struggles with dishonesty. They may feel free to lie, but their character is fragmented. By contrast, a person who has formed the habit of truthfulness acts with integrity and confidence. Their freedom is deeply because it is grounded in moral excellence. Having defined freedom as oriented toward excellence, we now turn to moral education and formation. How individuals grow into this kind of freedom over time. Reorienting moral education. We need to explore the implications of freedom for excellence for moral education. Instead of focusing primarily on rule enforcement, moral formation is presented as the cultivation of character. The goal is not merely to ensure compliance with laws, but to help persons become morally mature and capable of choosing the good freely. This perspective reframes how morality is taught and practiced. It shifts the central question from what am I allowed to do to who am I becoming? Moral theology becomes concerned with transformation rather than minimal obligation, emphasizing the development of virtues that shape a person's identity. In pastoral or educational context, this might mean guiding students not only to avoid wrongdoing, but to actively practice generosity, honesty, and compassion. Moral growth occurs through formation, mentoring, and lived experience rather than through rules alone. From this emphasis on formation, we now turn to one of the most important tools of moral development over time. Habit. Habit. This slide introduces the central role of habits in moral psychology. Habits are not mechanical routines, but stable dispositions that shape how we act. They influence freedom by making certain choices easier and more natural over time. Habits, therefore, connect freedom and responsibility across a person's life. They demonstrate that moral decisions are not isolated events, but parts of a process of formation. Over time, repeated actions shape character and determine how freely and easily a person chooses the good. For example, someone who regularly practices patience becomes less reactive in difficult situations. Their freedom grows because they are not dominated by impulse. Likewise, patience, repeated acts of kindness gradually form a person into someone who naturally responds with compassion. To understand these more clearly, the next slide defines what a habit is and how it operates in moral life. Habit as moral power. We need to define habit as a stable disposition residing in the intellect and will that inclines a person towards certain actions. Habits are formed through repeated acts and make similar actions easier, more spontaneous, and often more enjoyable. We need to emphasize that habit also shape identity. They do not only affect what we do, but who we become. Over time, habits create patterns of thinking and acting that influence moral responsibility and freedom. A musician, for example, who practices regularly develops a habit that allows them to play effortlessly. Similarly, someone who consistently chooses honesty becomes truthful almost intuitively. The habit becomes a moral power that strengthens their capacity for good action. So if habits take shape, or if habits shape freedom, the next question follows naturally. Do they increase freedom or do habits restrict it? Habits increase freedom. We present a paradox of habit here. Properly formed habits increase freedom rather than diminish it. Virtue becomes a second nature, enabling people to act well spontaneously without losing the capacity for choice. Freedom, therefore, is not always expressed through constant deliberation. A virtuous person may act quickly and instinctively, yet still freely, because their character is aligned with the good. Habit liberates rather than enslaves when it is rooted in virtue. A skilled pianist plays without thinking about every note, yet performs with great freedom and creativity. Similarly, a person formed in kindness or honesty responds naturally to moral situations. Their freedom is not reduced, it is strengthened through formation. However, we now acknowledge a critical reality. Not all habits are virtues. Some habits can distort freedom and worse, diminish responsibility. So not all habits are actually formative. That's what we're saying. Some can be just destructive. Have bad habits and diminished freedom. This slide explains how vicious habits such as addiction, dishonesty, or chronic anger can weaken freedom. They narrow perception, reinforce destructive patterns, and make it harder for the will to choose the good. Freedom becomes constraint, even though responsibility remains. So, here we connect this insight to a broader moral tradition. Sin creates bondage, it imprisons, while virtue brings liberation. A person trapped in harmful habits is less free, obviously, yet still accountable for the formation and continuation of those habits. For example, an individual struggling with addiction may genuinely want to change, but feel unable to act freely. Their freedom is diminished, but moral theology recognizes both the responsibility and the need for compassion, support, and gradual formation. Recognizing the role of habits in shaping freedom leads to a deeper question. How does moral formation unfold over time? And how do past experiences shape present responsibility? Formation over time. This slide introduces the contribution of contemporary moral theologian James Keenan, who emphasizes that moral responsibility must be understood within the context of formation over time. Human actions are not isolated decisions, they arise from a history of upbringing, experiences, habits, and ongoing growth. The slide highlights four stages: early formation, habit development, present actions, and future growth. These stages show that freedom develops gradually. Our current choices are shaped by past influences, yet they also shape our future. Moral theology, therefore, considers both continuity and change in a person's moral life. For example, a person raised in a supportive environment with strong moral guidance may find it easier to make virtuous choices. Conversely, someone formed in instability or neglect may struggle more. Still, both remain capable of growth, and moral theology affirms the possibility of transformation. From this developmental perspective, we now examine how such formation affects the way we evaluate moral responsibility. This slide explains how recognizing the role of formation leads to a more nuanced moral evaluation. It prevents harsh judgment by acknowledging the constraints imposed by past experiences, habits, and social conditions. At the same time, it avoids excusing wrongdoing by affirming that individuals still bear responsibility for shaping their character. The slide balances pastoral sensitivity with moral seriousness. Compassion is necessary when people struggle with ingrained habits, but responsibility remains for pursuing virtue and transformation. Moral assessment thus becomes both realistic and helpful in counseling and or pastoral care. Understanding a person's background, family environment, trauma, education helps explain their behavior. This insight encourages patience and support rather than condemnation, while still encouraging accountability and growth. Having examined formation and responsibility, the lecture now introduces a new perspective that focuses on subjective experiences of the acting person. And this is an insight we got from Karol Wojtyła. This slide introduces Karol Wojtyła, uh, Wojtyła, later Pope John Paul II, and his personalist approach to moral theology. While Aquinas focuses on the structure of moral acts, Wojtyła emphasizes the lived experience of the person who acts. Moral action is not merely extended behavior, but an expression of personal self-determination. This perspective deepens moral theology by highlighting the dignity and interiority of the human subject. Every moral choice reflects not only what a person does, but who they are becoming. Moral responsibility, therefore, involves both outward consequences and inner transformation. When someone chooses generosity, they not only help another person, they become more generous themselves. Likewise, repeated selfish choices shape a person into someone more self centered. Moral actions forms identity. To develop this insight, we explore what happens to the person internally when they act. The experience of the acting person. This slide focuses on the internal dimension of moral action. Wojtyla emphasizes that actions are moments of self-determination. Through choice, persons come to possess themselves more fully and shape their identity. We highlight three aspects here: the acting subject, self-possession, and personal development. Moral acts are therefore not just about outcomes, but about the formation of the person. Each decision contributes to the ongoing construction of the self. Choosing honesty strengthens a person's integrity. Choosing selfishness weakens it. Even small actions like keeping a promise, speaking kindly, showing patience, gradually shape character and identity. This leads us to a key insight. Moral actions do not only affect the world, they transform the person who performs them. They transform the persons who perform them. Moral acts shape the agent. We present Wojtyla's central insight. Every moral act has a double effect. It changes the external world and it shapes the internal character of the agent. We become what we choose. Our actions form not only consequences, but our moral identity. This understanding intensifies moral responsibility. People are accountable not only for what they do to others, but for what they do to themselves through their choices. Moral life becomes a process of self formation directed toward good or evil. For instance, repeatedly choosing kindness makes a person more compassionate, while habitual dishonesty erodes integrity. The moral life is therefore deeply personal. Every decision contributes to the kind of person one becomes. Within this personalist perspective established, we now turn to the dignity of the moral subject and the deeper implications of freedom for human identity and moral truth. Let's look at the dignity of the moral subject. We highlight the dignity of the human person as a moral subject. Building on Wojtyla's personalist approach, it presents the person not merely as someone who performs actions, but as a self-determining agent of unique worth. Moral life is not simply about evaluating behavior, but about recognizing the person as an irreplaceable center of freedom and responsibility. The slide emphasizes that subjectivity and objective truth are not opposed. The personal experience of choosing participates in moral truth rather than contradicting it. True freedom ultimately finds fulfillment in self-giving love, and moral actions shape identity more deeply than external circumstances. For example, treating another person merely as a means to an end, even for a good purpose, violates their dignity. Acts of respect, care, and self giving love affirm the moral subject's worth and reflect a proper understanding of freedom. From this affirmation of personal dignity, the lecture now examines a crucial implication. Moral acts are never neutral for the person who performs them. So, why moral acts are never neutral? We need to explain that every moral act strengthens or weakens the moral character of the person who performs it. Even when an action appears small or insignificant externally, it shapes the agent internally. Good choices increase one's capacity for goodness, while harmful choices diminish integrity. This insight makes moral theology deeply personal. The focus shifts from external rules or punishments to the formation of the self. Moral life becomes a process of becoming, either growing into virtue or drifting toward vice. For instance, repeatedly choosing patience strengthens self control, while repeatedly giving in to anger makes it more difficult to respond calmly in the future. Every decision contributes to the trajectory of a person's moral development. This understanding prepares us for a broader discussion of how freedom relates to truth and how moral limits in contemporary theology. Freedom, truth, and moral limits. We need to introduce a key theme in contemporary Catholic moral theology: the inseparable relationship between freedom and truth. Freedom is not authentic when detached from reality or moral goodness. It must be grounded in truth to lead to genuine fulfillment. We need to set the stage for discussing moral absolutes, norms that cannot be violated regardless of intention or circumstance. These limits are not restrictions on freedom, but safeguards that protect human dignity and guide moral reasoning. In modern culture, freedom is often equated with autonomy or doing whatever one desires. Catholic moral theology challenges this view by insisting that certain actions, such as injustice or exploitation, can never be justified, even for good purposes. We now present a major magisterial text that clarifies this relationship between freedom, truth, and norms. Veritatis Splendor. This slide introduces John Paul II's encyclical Veritatis Splendor, which addresses fundamental questions about freedom, conscience, and moral absolutes. The encyclical reaffirms that genuine freedom must be grounded in objective moral truth rather than detached autonomy. It also emphasizes the existence of intrinsically evil acts, actions that are wrong by their very nature, regardless of intention or circumstances. This teaching protects human dignity and ensures that moral reasoning does not become purely subjective. For example, acts that deliberately harm innocent persons cannot be justified by good intentions or beneficial outcomes. The teaching insists that moral limits are necessary to preserve respect for human life and dignity. We now deepen this teaching by examining the central claim of the encyclical and its implication to moral reasoning. Uh, what's the central teaching of Veritatis Splendor? We need to present the core teaching of Veritatis Splendor. Some acts are always seriously wrong by their nature. Their moral status does not change with circumstances or intentions. These provides clarity in moral reasoning and safeguards the integrity of moral truth. At the same time, we need to stress compassion. Recognizing moral absolutes does not mean ignoring the complexity of human situations. It calls for both firm commitment to truth and pastoral sensitivity toward those whose freedom is constrained. For instance, while certain actions remain morally wrong, individuals who commit them may have diminished responsibility due to ignorance, fear, or social pressures. Moral theology, therefore, balances truth with mercy. With this foundation established, we now explore why moral absolutes matter and how they function in protecting human dignity and guiding moral discernment. Why do moral absolutes matter? We need to explain the significance of moral absolutes in Catholic moral theology. It presents them not as a rigid restrictions but as a necessary safeguards that protect human dignity and preserve moral clarity. By affirming that some actions are intrinsically wrong, moral theology resists the idea that morality can be reduced to circumstances or outcomes alone. The slide highlights how moral absolutes provide stability in moral reasoning. They prevent relativism, reject the idea that end justifies the means, and serve as a witness to truth in a changing cultural landscape. Moral absolutes, therefore, function as anchors for ethical discernment. For example, acts that directly violate human dignity, such as exploitation or unjust harm, cannot be justified even if they produce beneficial results. This principle guides moral reasoning in fields like medicine, politics, and social life. However, the recognition of moral absolutes must be balanced with compassionate understanding of human limitations and struggles, balancing truth and compassion. We need to emphasize that moral theology must hold together objective moral truth and pastoral compassion. While moral norms remain firm, individuals often act within complex circumstances that affect their freedom and responsibility. The church's approach, therefore, is neither harsh judgment nor permissive relativism. It seeks to recognize factors that diminish responsibility while maintaining a commitment to moral truth. This balance reflects a pastoral concern for persons alongside fidelity to ethical principles. For instance, someone struggling with deeply ingrained habits or difficult life circumstances may need guidance and support rather than condemnation. Compassion does not deny moral truth, it accompanies individuals as they grow toward it. Having established this balance, we now apply the principles of freedom and responsibility to a contemporary case study. Let's introduce a moral ethical scenario, an AI hiring system that disadvantages certain ethnic groups without explicit malicious intent from any individual. The case raises questions about agency, responsibility, and structural injustice in complex technological systems. We need to show that moral theology must engage contemporary realities even when harm is unintended. Moral responsibility still exists. The scenario invites reflection on how traditional principles apply in modern contexts shaped by technology and institutional decision making. For example, a company implementing such a system might prioritize efficacy and productivity, yet the outcome could be unjust discrimination. The absence of direct intent does not eliminate moral concern. It requires deeper analysis of responsibility and ethical accountability. To analyze this case properly, we now apply Aquinas' framework of the three fronts of morality. So the three funds are object, intention, and circumstances to the AI hiring scenario. The object involves unjust discrimination, the intention may be efficiency or fairness, and the circumstances include technological mediation and corporate scale. The analysis shows that even good intentions and complex circumstances cannot justify a morally problematic object. However, the circumstances do affect how responsibility is distributed among individuals involved. Programmers, executives, HR personnel, and even users of the system may share responsibility in different degrees. The act of implementing a system that produces discriminatory outcomes raises ethical obligations to correct, monitor, and even reform it. This leads to deeper questions about how responsibility is assigned when actions involve many agents and systems rather than a single individual. But this raises very important questions about moral analysis because it raises questions about one, who bears responsibility? How does shared agency affect accountability? And what role does prudence play in technological context? These questions highlight the complexity of modern moral scenarios. The slide encourages critical reflection rather than simple answers. Moral responsibility may be distributed across many people, each contributing to the outcomes in different ways. Ethical analysis must therefore consider systems, structures, and collective decisions. For example, a programmer designing an algorithm, a manager approving it, and an HR officer implementing it all participate in shaping its effects. Even those who benefit from unjust systems may bear some responsibility to challenge and reform them. With these questions raised, the lecture now moves towards deeper examination of layered responsibility and the concept of structural sin in moral theology. Let's look at layers of moral responsibility. We need to explain that responsibility in complex situations such as institutional or technological system exists in layers, no? In layers. Different individuals contribute different ways, and therefore should, and different degrees, and therefore bear different degrees of accountability. Responsibility is not eliminated by complexity in this case, it is distributed. So the slide emphasizes that designers, decision makers, implementers, and beneficiaries in this case may all share moral responsibility. Moral theology recognizes that harm can result from collective action even when no single person intends the outcome. In the AI hiring example, programmers who design the algorithm, executives who approve it, and HR personnel who implement it each participate in the moral process. Even passive beneficiaries may have a responsibility to question and address injustice. To deepen this idea, the lecture now introduces the concept of structural sin and how systems shape moral action. This slide presents the idea of structures of sin, something that we will also discuss later on, patterns and systems that perpetuate injustice even without deliberate malicious intent from individuals. Social, economic, and institutional arrangements can shape behavior in ways that influence moral outcomes. At the same time, structural sin does not remove individual responsibility. Systems are created and sustained by human choices. Individuals remain accountable for their participation in unjust structures and for working toward reform. For example, discriminatory hiring practices may become embedded in organizational culture even if no one person designed them intentionally. Individuals still have a moral duty to recognize and challenge them. Recognizing the systemic realities highlights the importance of prudence in navigating complex ethical situations. Prudence in technological ethics. This slide emphasizes prudence as a crucial virtue in moral technological contexts. Prudence involves practical wisdom, phronesis, anticipating consequences, weighing risks, and making responsible decisions in uncertain conditions. In technological fields, prudence requires foresight and accountability. Decisions about systems, algorithms, and policies must consider potential harms, biases, and unintended consequences. Moral responsibility includes careful planning and ethical reflection before action. For instance, developers should test algorithms for bias, organizations should monitor outcomes, and leaders should remain open to revising or halting systems when ethical problems arise. Prudence ensures that innovation remains aligned with human dignity. We now broaden the discussion by reflecting on how traditional moral principles remain relevant in contemporary ethical challenges. Relevance for contemporary moral challenges. We need to show that Aquinas' principles, such as the three funds, voluntariness and prudence, remains applicable even in modern contexts like AI, corporate systems, and global institutions. While the circumstances have changed, the fundamental moral framework continues to guide ethical discernment. We need to emphasize that moral theology must engage new realities without abandoning its foundational insights. Timeless principles must be thoughtfully applied to emerging challenges. Issues such as automation, bioethics, social inequality require applying classical moral reasoning to new contexts. The framework helps ensure that technological progress remains aligned with moral responsibility and flourishing. After exploring these applications and recognizing them, we now begin to draw together its main themes and prepare for its concluding synthesis. Conclusion. We begin the conclusion by summarizing the lesson's central insight. Freedom is the foundation of moral growth. Human actions becomes morally meaningful because persons act knowingly and voluntarily, shaping both the world and themselves. We gathered the themes explored: freedom, responsibility, virtue, and formation. Moral life is presented as a journey of growth, guided by truth and oriented towards the good. Every decision, whether small or significant, contributes to moral development. Acts of honesty, compassion, courage, and justice strengthen character and deepen freedom. Moral theology, therefore, invites continual growth rather than static compliance. The lecture now proceeds to synthesize its core principles and articulate the enduring foundations for understanding moral responsibility. Core principles established. We gather the major principles developed throughout the lesson into a coherent summary. It highlights 5 key insights: the necessity of knowledge and voluntariness, the 3 funds of morality, freedom for excellence, the shaping power of habits, and the way actions form the person. Together, these provide the conceptual foundation for understanding moral responsibility. These functions as a synthesis. Rather than introducing new ideas, it integrates them into a single framework that shows how freedom, truth, and moral formation are interconnected. Moral theology emerges as a comprehensive vision of human action and growth. For example, when evaluating a moral decision, one must consider whether the person acted knowingly and freely, what the object and intention were, and how habits and past formation influence the choice. This integrated approach ensures a balanced and accurate moral assessment. Having summarized the core principles, the lecture now returns to one of its central themes: the relationship between truth and freedom. We need to emphasize that authentic freedom cannot exist apart from truth. Freedom is not autonomy from reality, but the ability to confront oneself to what is genuinely good. When freedom and truth are unified, human actions leads to fulfillment and moral growth. These challenges modern views that separate freedom from moral reality. Catholic moral theology insists that freedom finds its fulfillment, not its restriction, in truth. Truth provides direction, purpose, and meaning to human choice. A person who understands the value of honesty experiences greater freedom to act with integrity. By contrast, someone detached from truth may feel free to choose anything but becomes morally confused and internally fragmented. With that clarified, we now shift towards the interior dimension of moral life, conscience. This slide marks a transition from analyzing the structures of moral acts to exploring the inner judgment of conscience. Conscience is presented as the interior faculty that applies moral truth to specific situations and guides personal discernment, something that we will also deep dive in soon. The slide connects external actions, intentions, and circumstances with the inner process of evaluation. Moral life is not only about what we do, but about how we judge and understand our actions. Conscience becomes the bridge between objective moral truth and personal decision making. For instance, when deciding whether to speak truthfully in a difficult situation, a person reflects internally on the moral implications, weighing object, intention, and circumstances. The process of discernment is the work of conscience. Recognizing the role of conscience leads to the practical implications for ministry, education, and moral formation. We need to explore how the principles discussed apply in pastoral or educational patterns, contexts. Understanding the factors that affect voluntariness allows ministers and educators to guide people with both truth and compassion. We need to highlight three areas: compassionate discernment, virtue formation, conscience formation. Moral education becomes less about enforcing rules and more about shaping persons capable of sound judgment. In pastoral counseling, this might involve helping someone understand the influence of fear, habits, or ignorance on their choices while encouraging growth toward virtue. The goal is not condemnation, but transformation. The lecture now culminates in a final reflection on human dignity, moral agency, and the significance of freedom. The dignity of moral agency. We affirm a central insight. Every human person is a moral agent endowed with dignity and capable of genuine self-determination. Freedom enables individuals to shape their lives and identities with both truth through moral choices oriented towards truth and goodness. This slide underscores both empowerment and responsibility. Humans are not determined solely by biology, psychology, or society. They possess real freedom to pursue holiness or frail morally. The stakes of moral life are therefore profound. Each decision, whether to act justly, show compassion, or pursue selfishness, contributes to who a person becomes. Moral agency means we participate actively in shaping our character and destiny. With this affirmation of human dignity, the lecturer now prepares to conclude by pointing toward further study, reflection, and application of these principles in ongoing formation. So we've identified the sources, readings, and the like. And I'd like to, so these are the key sources that we used. These are for recommendations for further reading. Now, let's look at some review questions for reflection. We present review questions designed to reinforce comprehension and stimulate reflection. They revisit key themes such as Aquinas' concept of freedom, the three fronts of morality, the role of habit, and the influence of personal formation. The purpose of these questions is not merely academic recall, but integration. They encourage you to connect theoretical insights with practical moral reasoning and personal experience. For example, you might reflect on how habits have shaped your own decision making or how freedom relates to truth in everyday choices. Such reflection can help translate abstract principles into lived moral experience. Moving from personal reflection, we now encourage collaborative engagement through structured discussion questions. And that's the reason why you have discussion questions for class here also. Something that you would like to pay attention to. And also some case studies for you to reflect on and the like. So we also encourage you to consider the other lessons that we still have in mind and will still develop further questions on natural law, virtue, or even conscience, which is the next lecture actually. Uh, I'd like to talk about common questions that we would like to also consider as we move forward here. And here you see common questions that I want you to pay attention to. Okay. Uh, so remember, God's image remains to be a very important role there, no, in the human person. Now, in terms of the common misunderstandings, we need to address common misconceptions about freedom, intention, habits, and moral absolute. It clarifies that freedom is not unlimited choice, that good intentions do not justify harmful means, and that habits do not eliminate freedom, or that moral absolutes do not ignore contexts. By correcting these misunderstandings, we protect the integrity of moral theology and ensures that you interpret freedom and responsibility accurately and avoid reducing moral life to either rigid legalism or subjective relativism. Something that I'd like you to pay attention to. I'll jump and look and stay here. No? Looking ahead. Uh, the final slide summarizes the lesson and prepares for what follows. It reiterates that freedom, human action, and moral responsibility provide the foundation for understanding conscience, sin, grace, and the call to holiness. The study of moral theology continues as deeper explorations of how freedom responds to divine grace. We frame the moral life as an ongoing journey. Learning about moral responsibility is not an end point, but a beginning, a preparation for more profound discernment and spiritual growth. Students, you are encouraged to carry forward the principles learned, knowledge, and voluntariness. The three funds, virtue formation, personal responsibility, into future lessons and real life decisions. These tools guide both academic reflection and lived moral practice. With this looking forward perspective, the lecture now concludes by inviting you to continued study, reflection, and commitment to living out freedom responsibly in response to truth and grace. There. As we conclude this lecture, we are reminded that freedom is not merely a power we possess, it's a calling we must live. Every choice we make, whether quiet or dramatic, shapes not only the world around us, but the person we are becoming. Moral life is not a checklist of rules, but a journey of transformation from impulse to intention, from confusion to truth, from self centeredness to self giving love. You have seen that freedom reaches its full meaning when guided by truth, strengthened by virtue, and directed toward the good. We are not trapped by our past, nor determined by our weaknesses. With knowledge, grace, and deliberate choice, we grow. We become more capable of justice, compassion, courage, and fidelity. Moral responsibility, then, is not a burden alone. It is a profound dignity. It means our lives matter, our decisions matter, our growth matter. So as you leave this lesson today, carry this conviction. Every act of goodness enlarges your freedom. Every honest choice strengthens your character. Every moment of courage moves you closer to who you are meant to be. The moral life is not about perfection achieved overnight, but about faithfulness lived day by day. And in that faithful journey, guided by truth, sustained by grace, and expressed in love, we discover the deepest meaning of freedom and the true greatness of the human person. I hope this lecture moved you and taught you something new. Thank you very much for listening.